All right, friends, I'm back to talk about Saturn and Sun conjunction. In fact, I believe I will be making 3 videos, at least I want to make 3 videos, about this dynamic between Saturn and Sun. And in this video, I just want to talk about the conjunction, just the raw meaning, the symbols, and how we interpret them, and why this is such a problematic conjunction. In the next video, I'm just going to focus on the current transit of Sun and Saturn in Pisces. So if you have this connection, or let's say you have Sun and Saturn in a square position or in opposition, the way I'm describing things in this video will also apply, as well as if you have your Sun and Saturn conjunct in a synastry chart. So let's say you have Saturn in your chart, and the person that you're looking at, the person that you're in a dynamic with, and you're looking at their chart, they have Sun conjunct your Saturn. So in that sense, this video applies to all of these topics. And if you guys see random thumbs up here and there in the video, is because when I make these videos, I'm not looking at myself. It's very distracting. I'm just basically, I have my outline in front of me and I'm just talking to the camera. So if you guys see random thumbs up, like when I say that someone dies and then it gives a thumbs up, I'm not purposely giving a thumbs up to that. I try to edit them out, but sometimes I overlay the voice, so it's impossible to edit it out. And one more thing before moving on, if you guys find this content valuable and you like it, please remember to subscribe, like, and comment, especially your comments. I very much value them because it allows me to see a fuller spectrum of how these symbols, how these archetypes are manifesting themselves in people's lives. And if we read each other's comments, it really helps too, because we start to get a better grasp of what they're indicating, especially because they're placed in a specific house or in a specific sign. So it really matters. And if you guys are interested in my readings, classes, you can go to my website at parisayazzi.com. You can also go to the About section of YouTube. All the links are there, so you guys can go check that out. And I think that sums up the intro and the housekeeping. And now we can get right into what does Saturn and Sun conjunct, or when they make a connection in the charts, what does this mean? So I want to start this video with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is this. This is one of the most difficult conjunctions to have in a chart, but only when we don't have a great sense of maturity. And the reason I say that is because both of these planets are representing power. And if we don't know what to do with power, as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility, there can be a lot of havoc. And in some ways, Sun and Saturn are showing us a spectrum of power. So we got Sun as the central position, like the king, like the ruler, and Saturn at the margin of the solar system, at the end of the solar system, is like the class that is ruled by this king. We're talking about, if we want to talk from a Marxist perspective, we've got the owners of the means of production, and then we have the working class and the proletariat, right? So we got this dynamic of the ruler and the ruled. And we know the king can be oppressive and oppress the working class and the general population and exploit them. And we also know that the working class historically can have a revolution to overthrow the king. So there's this inherent dynamic when there's this kind of a planetary combination, which is talking about power relations and power dynamics. So Sun and Saturn are telling us something about a kind of a tug of war that's going back and forth from the center to the margin. And before we gain a sense of maturity, this power dynamic in our real life experiences can feel like something that is life denying for the Saturn person, let's say in a synastry chart for a Saturn person and the Sun person. But when there's maturity and we know how to operate within the entirety of the spectrum of power dynamics, we're actually talking about a powerhouse. So in a synastry chart, we're talking about a power couple. These two human beings who are connected, maybe they're colleagues, maybe they are husband and wife. They represent a kind of a powerhouse. But when it's dysfunctional, God forbid, this is just continuous power struggle between the two people. And the way I want to approach this video is going to be a little bit different than what we're usually accustomed to. I actually want to turn this whole paradigm on its head. Because the general assumption is when Sun comes into conjunction with Saturn, it is Sun that's suffering, Sun that represents the self, the ego, the identity, the I, my confidence, who I am, my self-concept. So we're always saying Saturn as a bad guy, especially because Saturn is a malefic. But we need to recognize that Saturn is also suffering. And because of its suffering, it's casting its negative and malefic gaze on the sun, unlike any other planet. And if we understand this hardship, then we can start to understand what this dynamic, this combination is generally about. And I've been thinking about this for a while and hard. What kind of narrative, what kind of a mythology can I put forth that has the best representation of this so that we understand its symbolism? And the one that is already very explicit, so you can actually start doing your own Google search Shani and Surya. Shani in the Vedic tradition is Saturn and Surya is the sun. You'll see this dynamic explicitly explained. So I'm going to use this tradition and its narrative, what we today call mythologies, to get a better grasp of this. And this particular narrative centers itself around the dynamic between a father and a son. So the father here is the sun, and the son here in the story is Saturn. And there's something else to remember with this word myth. I think it's worth just saying something for a minute. The ancients anthropomorphized forces of nature. They had a very good recognition how nature and its functions were also part of our drives. And I would argue this is how they correlated the self, the human, life on Earth, to the above. The above is representing these existential functions, and they anthropomorphize them in order to have a personal relationship with them and in order to recognize it in themselves and in their environments and how they can navigate and negotiate with it. And the way that they have anthropomorphized Sun and Saturn, they have almost two opposing objectives in terms of what they're operationalizing. So when they come into a conjunction, they create a lot of havoc. So I'm going to take you into the story. I'm going to walk you through the story, and then we'll start to explore the symbolism of these planets and why they do what they do. Now, before we go there, I want you to summon your imagination because we need our emotions and feelings to feel this on a visceral level, to understand why Saturn's so malefic and why Saturn does these weird things that we human beings consider very crappy. And where we have to start with this process of empathy is to understand that none of us, not even the gods in their stories, have control over their initial conditions and the kind of circumstances that they're born into. For example, they don't decide who their parents are. Generally, there are some stories that they do. And by the virtue of having these initial conditions, it's determining the trajectory of the rest of their narrative and story. And I say this and I bring this up because in these stories, Saturn is the illegitimate son of the son of Surya. So Shani as Saturn is the illegitimate son of Surya, who's the sun. Now, like this wasn't bad enough. Saturn is also born to a father who is the most powerful. He's radiant, he's life-generating, he's illuminating. In fact, he's the manifestation of divine itself. Like the sun is a manifestation of the Godhead in a lot of ways. It is a representation of God. For example, the sun represents soul and consciousness. And in this tradition, there is an ultimate being where the Atma were the manifested branches of it coming from that oversoul, for lack of a better word. So his father is the soul, consciousness, and everything just waits for his rising every day so that they can rise and they can become conscious, to have some kind of a life force within them, and a father who's revered and loved by all. So we got a pretty powerful father to begin with. Now, you wouldn't think this would be a problem. Okay, your dad is powerful, big deal. But imagine from the moment that you're born, this powerful father instinctively dislikes you and shuns you. And pun intended, Shani as Saturn, the father shuns Shani. Imagine you're born and right away your father thinks you're ugly. You're not like him. You're pretty unworthy. The father, your father is asking like, how's this kid of my lineage? Look at this child. What's wrong with it? Imagine in your father's eyes, he sees you as something deformed, something that's subpar and just a source of his shame. And because of his own inner feeling, he's just very determined to marginalize you and exclude you. from his love, his affection, his embrace, or any kind of an acceptance. So this is the initial condition of Saturn and what he's born into in his narrative. This is the first experience of Shani. When I say Shani, Shani is Saturn, Saturn's Shani. So this is the first experience of Shani, of not just his father, but of his own existence. We know as kids, while we're growing up, we come to have a self-concept. We get wired and configured through the gaze of our parents. And we'll see this explains a lot about Saturn's psychology and why he does what he does. We'll see why he becomes cruel and punishing, which has to do with this dynamic with his father. And Saturn, just to go back to, well, how is he a legitimate son of the sun? Well, Surya, how did that happen? So Sun has an original wife, and her name is Sanjana. Sanjana gets to a point where she feels so overwhelmed by the sun's power and radiance and luminosity, just blinding, that she needed some respite. She needed to get away from her husband just to recuperate and not to have this burning effect that the sun has. And she already has 3 kids with the sun. So she is actually a loving wife and a loving mother, and she wants to be there for her husband and for her kids. But how do you do that if you yourself are getting destroyed? So she needed to get away, but in order to have her husband and her children cared for, she creates a shadow version of herself, like a clone of herself, a hologram of herself. I don't know how to describe it, but she duplicates herself. She creates a version of herself, and her name is Chaya. So as Sanjana turns herself into a form of a mare, a horse, and comes to the earthly realm into the forest to get that respite, Chaya is taking care of Surya and his 3 children. But in the meanwhile, Chaya has 3 kids with Surya, the sun. And one of these kids that she has is Saturn. So in some ways, when we take the symbolic meaning of the story, Saturn is kind of an illegitimate son of the sun. Saturn is born of a lie. He's born to a shadow, to darkness, and he's born to a mother that's essentially not the real wife of his father. So in a lot of ways, he's born into a circumstance of weakness, again, talking about that thing that he can't control. And this weakness is not essentially Saturn's weakness as a child when he's born. This weakness is Sanjana's weakness that's also being passed down to Saturn because of the overwhelm that she felt that she needed to escape. So when you think about it, Saturn is born into some sort of a paradox, into a lot of contradiction. His genetic makeup has a kind of a strange duality in it. Half of it is from his father, which is pure power, light, illumination, and truth. And the other half is of his mother, Chaya, which is of darkness, shadow, something that's opaque and unreal, because she's essentially not real. She's like a clone, a stand-in wife. So it's kind of an unreality that he's born into. And this half of his nature, which is of his mother Chaya, is a complete antithesis to what his father and his lineage is. And if we think about it, this legacy becomes Shani, or Saturn's burden in his life, is something that he inherits and something that he has to carry, whether he likes it or not, just like all of us. I mean, the kind of parents that we were born to. Some of us have loving parents, some of us have psychotic, crazy parents. And both of them impact us in a way that carries itself through our entire life. It has an impact. And our job, just like the way Saturn's would be anyone, is to come and reconcile these differences or dichotomies or opposing ways of being throughout our lifetime. And how does Saturn reconcile this when you think about this weird, strange paradox that he's born into? Saturn, what does Saturn do? Saturn becomes the revealer of reality. And he becomes the revealer of it in all of its brutality and its glory. So that's why I was asking you to imagine this, because we always imagine Saturn as the bad guy and the sun as the good guy. But when we empathize with his initial condition, we can recognize what we today call trauma and weaknesses that he has inherited. And those are also his burden that he has to work with. And by understanding this kind of a narrative, we can start to understand, okay, when we have this combination in our chart, when we have it in a synastry chart with another, how can we come to reconcile these energies that are so oppositional and so brutal in a lot of ways? And just to go back to the story, because it's quite telling, the details of it. I was saying what Sun's reaction was when he saw his own son, when Surya saw Shani. He just recoiled in disgust and he refused to acknowledge Saturn as his own. So, in a lot of ways, the father is rejecting the son. Now, imagine we're in that position. What happens? Our parent looking at us with disgust, contempt, and they reject us. We're naturally are just going to have anger and contempt ourselves. There's a sense of resentment suddenly towards the parents because we expect them by nature, even that they love us unconditionally. So, Saturn, in this moment of his birth, when he sees that his father's looking at him like that, he looks back at his father. He's kind of born rebellious from the beginning, too. That's part of his own genetic, too. And the way that he casts his gaze back onto his father, it was so intense and destructive that it just, that initial gaze by Saturn also sets the entire narrative of them into its own trajectory too. So Shani's gaze as an aspect is known to be malefic. It's heavy and it's karmic. And he possessed this kind of a gaze from the beginning, which stems from his dynamic from his father, which is the sun. And going back, when he cast that gaze on his father as an infant, it's been said that the sun immediately started to feel weak, started to lose its strength and brilliance because of Saturn. It's been said that Surya became a little bit more pale and a little less radiant. But when we think about, well, it's pretty self-explanatory by this point, but if we think about it, why did Saturn cast that gaze on his father? It wasn't just anger and contempt. He was recognizing, even as an infant, these are gods. So, as infants that have the kind of consciousness we wouldn't have after 1,000 lifetimes, he recognized his father's unhealthy ego and excessive pride by just rejecting him and not accepting him because he doesn't look like the sun. He doesn't have the same kind of an appearance, that kind of luminosity that he has. And if we think about it within ourselves, when we have that kind of an ego and that kind of a pride, what do we do to other human beings? We're constantly dehumanizing them. We undermine what they need, who they are, what they're about. And in this case, an egotistical God, in some sense, through his prideful way of thinking, is reducing another God, because Shani, by its lineage, is a god. In some ways, one could have looked at Shani and see Shani as the way Saturn is and accept him that way. There's a kind of a perfection in that. But Saturn, the sun's pride would not allow that. And just like the way, Saturn had a certain kind of a consciousness as an infant. But again, we inherit our parents' quality, right? So that gaze that Saturn casts on his father is doing exactly what the father did to him. The father rejected him. And Saturn right away comes to reject his own father. Monkey see, monkey do kind of a situation. We do what we learn as children, and that becomes part of our wiring. And essentially, what Saturn is rejecting, we could say Saturn's rejecting his father in his totality, or we could say Saturn is rejecting his father's ego and pride. And we could interpret it that way because a lot of us go through a lot of hardship with our family, but when we dig deep, at the core of us, we love our family, but we absolutely might hate certain aspects or certain behavior that comes out of them. So in some ways, Saturn's gaze is showing his defiance for this quality that's in the sun, in his own father. And we can see how Saturn is related to the things that happen to us that humbles us in life. Saturn loves to come in and intervene in places where people are abusing their power, where the powerful come to disable and disarm the powerless and to render someone powerless or a group of people powerless. This is where Saturn loves to cast his gaze. And in a lot of ways, we can look at this because of his own story. It's like Saturn's gaze can be seen almost as a curse, right? But it's not an arbitrary affliction. It's serving as a kind of a divine justice. He's ensuring that the unjust are humbled. And we can see this is coming from Saturn's own origin story. And in fact, this idea or narrative of justice is not only about Shani, it runs deep in Surya's family with his other children too. For instance, the other son that Surya, the son, has with his first wife, Sanjana, the original wife, is Yama. So he's the older brother of Saturn. And who's he? He's the god of death. He's the judge of all souls after when they die. He's the one who determines what our karma is, what we did in this lifetime. And based on calculation of that karma, he designates the next life to us. So he's a god of justice in some way. He's very dharmic. And when we think about what does Shani do, Shani is also delivering justice in the form of that, because Saturn represents time, right? So it's taking that karmic batch and delivering justice, but not in death, in actual life as we're alive. Saturn's ensuring that for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And in some ways, both Shani, Saturn, and his brother Yama are representing what it means to maintain that fine line of power, to have it, to utilize it, but not to abuse it. And as we saw from the story, even Saturn's mighty father was not exempt from this. And we can see now, just from this part of the story, why is it that when Saturn and Sun come into conjunction, we experience so much pain and there's a sense of suffering with it. And that's because a lot of times we have these faulty egos. We have these self-concepts or sense of self that doesn't correspond to reality. We're using our power. Actually, we're misusing our power in a lot of circumstances. So when this conjunction happens, this is a time to be humbled down. It's time to see reality. And it's bringing the other significations of Saturn in, because when we're challenged to the core of our being in that way, when Saturn looks at us, casts his gaze on us, and it's like, what you do is harmful. And in order for me to show you how you're being harmful, I'm going to inflict harm on you. And this requires us to have a lot of humility. Again, significations of Saturn. What Saturn's trying to do is to strip away our pride and our sense of power that's essentially false power. So far, we can see why this conjunction has a bit of a problem. Now, in this section, I want to talk a little bit more about the narrative, because it starts to give us an imagery of Saturn and why Saturn is the way that it is and why this conjunction pans out the way that it does. So I came to pause the video for a second. I think I stopped it. I just hope it's recording. But let's get back to the story. So like the story wasn't bad enough. It's going to get a little bit more brutal. This is like almost like a story of an abusive father now, which is important to remember because the physical attributes given to Saturn, like Saturn's old, Saturn has a limp, it actually comes from this narrative. So going back to that point when Sun sees his own father, Sun sees his own son, Surya sees Shani, and he's so repulsed by Shani. This is one version of the story. Sun grabs his own sun. This becomes so confusing, sun and the sun. You know what I mean? The sun, the solar sun, grabs his own son, which is Saturn, and just hurls him with great force to the edge of the solar system, as far as he could throw him away from himself, which is the center. Hence, Saturn being the last planet in the solar system. Sun just wanted him as far as he could get him from himself. It's like not wanting to see the truth that, yes, this could be your son, the way that he looks, the way that he's unlike you. And it's been said that this violent throwing act of Shani, of Saturn, caused him a great injury to his leg. So he broke his leg. And this left him with that permanent limp, hence Saturn being represented as walking with a cane, hunched over, being very slow. And we can see this in Saturn's distant orbits. I mean, it's the longest orbiting planet, not considering the modern 3 planets. The 7 traditional planet takes 28.5 years for Saturn to orbit around the sun, whereas the next planet over Jupiter only takes 12 years. So in some ways, Saturn's slow movement is related to this part of the story. Saturn's related to outcasts, people who've been marginalized, who live on the margins. It represents quote unquote common people, the working class. people who are struggling in life. And we can see this is coming from Saturn's own narrative as his own personal experience. And relative to his own father, he was treated like someone who was an underclass person. He was disenfranchised from his own family, his own father, and was marginalized. In a lot of ways, Saturn was impoverished of the kind of parental love that we need to flourish. And we can see how Saturn becomes the archetype of hardship, limitations, and the things that we have to endure in life. It's like those instances in life where we feel so helpless, just pushed to the margin and just struggling to stay alive. It's a kind of an injury in life. And it's often, when we look at it sociologically, the disenfranchised people who are struggling. It is because of those in a position of power setting up systems where there can be no inclusion and no support. Like someone who's living paycheck to paycheck, someone who has financial problems, the way that you have to distribute that money out, the way that your mind gets consumed by the daily tasks and how hard you have to work just to maintain the integrity of life. It's all represented by Saturn, and we can see how it's coming from Saturn's own narrative in this tradition. And the limp is also saying something about karmic burdens that we all carry. It slows us down. Like states of being, feelings such as shame and guilt are related to Saturn. Shame and guilt, those heavy feelings, any kind of heavy feeling that we have in life, slows us down, slows us physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, in every possible way. Like, for example, Saturn's related to depression. This depression, that depressed state, slows us down. It causes us pain. There's an internal subjective perception of pain at all times. And it requires a lot of endurance and, in some ways, perseverance, even though you don't have the energy to be able to come out of that. So that karmic burden, that general burden of life that's placed on us is coming through Saturn significations. And we can see Saturn has these qualities because of his initial conditions, going back to the beginning of the story. It's defining the essence of Shani. Shani is doing what Shani knows. It's shaped by his own personal experiences and the hardships that came with it. But we also have to remember, once when Shani was thrown to the edge of the solar system, he didn't just lay down there to die. He got up. He's going to walk slow, but he's going to walk slow. So he's representing, and when I was saying they're representing a spectrum of power, imagine being that person and you are able to make it to the finish line. You have some kind of an inner resilience and endurance that another person would just lay down and die, but not Shani, not Saturn. Shani chose to get up and face his own reality, even if as an infant he has to walk like an old person with a cane, slowly, painfully. So in some ways it's saying something about his strength also. It's saying something about why he's related to reality. He had the strength to face his own reality. And at the end of the day, he didn't get up to become rogue and get out of the solar system and to slowly walk somewhere else. He actually got up to start orbiting his own father again. So in a lot of ways, when we consider what the symbols of the sun, what they're about, and what Saturn or Shani's symbolisms are, they're representing opposites. It's representing light versus darkness, luminosity versus shadow, vitality, weakness, privilege, and hardship. But again, as I just said, Saturn didn't go rogue. Saturn's still orbiting the sun. So it's talking about that when we have this conjunction via transit or in our birth chart, we have to learn how to reconcile it. And often this reconciliation comes from understanding what it means to be humble, to keep our inflated ego in check, to understand how to use our power. In essence, as much as Saturn went through the hardships that it went with his own father, Saturn doesn't want us to die. Saturn wants us to be life generating, or this life possessing, the life that we possess, to possess it, but with responsibility and accountability for the power that's invested in all of us. He doesn't want us to become life denying, even though that's what he does. That's the function of Saturn because of his negating and limiting, constricting ways of being. This is something that I'm going to discuss in another video. that where I'm going to talk about Saturn. And Saturn's trying to show us what reality is really like as it is, rather than through the lens of the ego and the illusions and the delusions that can come with it. It wants us to take our self-concept and have a conformity to reality. This is one of the ways that we can be responsible. Because let's say we're in a relationship dynamic. The person has a very morbid self-concept, or a very, not the word morbid, they have a very egotistical, like it should be about me. Everything should be about me. Acknowledge me, see me. I don't care how you feel. It's about me. Like narcissistic kind of a personality, right? What they are demanding of the world is not in correspondence to the world, because they are marginalizing other people. They're pushing other people, disenfranchising them. So Saturn wants this conformity of the self-concept to reality. And this is why Saturn is known as the planet of maturity. Maturation is Saturn's significations. Because when we're able to do that, we're actually life generating, we're life preserving, we're life giving. We act as powerful centers where our power is for the benefit of others and not just to boost our own ego and what we need. And again, going back to that concept of justice and karma as has been related to Saturn, if you think about karma, for every action, there's a reaction. The force of karma in that sense is confront reality. And since we're talking about the sun, the self, we have to understand this concept of conforming to the reality of things, not the fantasy and the illusions of the self. And Saturn's cruelty is that, hey, if you're going to be that way, if you want to violate reality, you don't want to have that conformity to it, I'm going to diminish that pride by taking away your vitality, your resources, the way that you feel you have power. I know when we look back at his father's story in terms of what he did to him, the sun, that life-generating principle, the life force itself, the soul, denied Shani the reality of what it means to be someone's son. So it's telling us when we have too much ego and pride, we're denying the essential truth and the order of life, how life is structured to be functional. And it's funny, the opaque, the dark, and the cold planet has to even become the truth revealer, even though the sun represents the truth. Shani, Saturn's representing truth as reality to his own father, to the ultimate, to the most powerful. You know, there's something in the Vedic culture, there's a concept of Rita, is like there's a cosmic order of how things are supposed to unfold. Is the way that existence maintains that structural and that inherent order that's within it. And Saturn's job is not actually to destroy it, is to maintain the integrity of that order. And you know, Saturn as a child becoming the revealer of reality to his own father, it's kind of very much present in human life too, right? What do children do? When people have children, children become the reality revealers to their parents also, even if they're not egotistical and not humble and prideful and etc. I mean, from the moment that children are born, they bring a certain set of hardship to the parents. Yes, we love them, we want them, but those first 2 years of sleepless nights and the kind of work that it requires for another 18 to 20 years, where you have to work tirelessly and constantly be at service to the children, is representing this father and son dynamic again. And the children are revealing a kind of a reality to their parents. And in essence, the parents are supposed to give their life force to their children. So it's not that I have children, therefore I'm augmenting my strength. You're actually transferring your power to this new being that you're bringing into life. And the only strength that we'll come to see from having children by the end of our life is our endurance, the resiliency. And in that, the parents can claim their power by being at service of another human being, not in their ego of, I created a human being, which a lot of people say, which is kind of funny because that's not children's function is. That's a faulty way of thinking about it, because parents, by the end of their life, if they're actually good parents, they have sacrificed much for their children. So I just wanted to bring that up to show that Saturn, even as a child, the things that he does to his father, he's trying to reveal even this kind of mundane reality that all of us human beings are subject to. And this story in general, again, to say it, is that It's like that phrase of with great power comes great responsibility. And if we don't know what that means in life, when these two planets are in conjunction, it's saying something about you need to understand that and understand that reality and how to be responsible for the kind of power that you have. And then from an archetypal perspective, this is very common. We gotta get out of the shadow of our parents, right? Being born to such a powerful father in the shadow of the father. And it's kind of ironic that the mother of Saturn is a shadow, and Saturn's considered to be darker, not illuminated. So we're also talking about, in general, how to get out of that immense power, that parental power that is over us, and what that requires. And that requires a lot of resiliency, endurance, wisdom, and maturity in life too. And this whole concept of overcoming the father's shadow is very prominent in the general narrative of Surya, the sun, in this tradition. Like we already saw what happened to Shani. And I also mentioned Yama's mother being Sanjana, but his story also has these themes of justice and darkness in it too. And then both of Surya's kids, Yama and Shani, they both have a limp, where Shani, Saturn's limp, is caused by his father, which is the sun, and then Yama's limp is caused by Saturn's mom, Chaya, the shadow planet, who puts a curse on Yama, and then Yama has a limp. So in a sense, the limp, one coming from the mother and one coming from the father, is talking about that immense amount of power that our parents have over us. It's the kind of, we see this all the time. Parents, because of their own egotistical ways or because of their ignorant ways and not wanting to lose that role and that position that is very much related to the ego and the identity. They don't want to give that up. They clip their kids' wings. They don't let them fly. And in a lot of ways, that's a misuse of parental power. In a sense, they're disabling their children. To have a limp is a kind of a disability. And what happens when we have a limp, when we can't take off, when we can't fly? We're just like Saturn, we're pushed into the margins. The person is fighting for their self-worth for the rest of their life to have a sense of dignity, for example. So again, the Sun-Saturn conjunction is also telling us something about those parental power that is hindering understanding our own power, because there's a power imbalance and a power dynamic. It's not uncommon when these planets come into conjunction. We find ourselves at conflict with parental figures, those who inherently from the get-go have more power over us. And you know, this legacy of the son as the father and even as a husband, it's demonstrating how with great power comes great responsibility, because even his own wife had to flee from him. And in other stories, when he finds out that Chaya is a stand-in wife and his own wife, the original wife, got away from him, he wants his wife back. So he goes to sages and to other gods to figure out, well, how do I get my wife back? And they told him a simple truth that he should have known: dim your light. And it's been said like something like he dims his light by 20% so that Sanjana can be in his presence. So it's saying something about how our sense of self and our ego, or our parents' ego, it can be so overwhelming that it becomes life-denying, even though the sun itself represents life. It's about generating life. So when Saturn comes into conjunction with the sun, it's trying to dim the power of the sun, our power, the power of the self. But I mean, it feels malefic, but if we think about it, it's not out of malice. It's trying to actually reveal to us how much power we do have and how destructive it can be if we don't know how to exert it in the right amount, in the right place, with some maturity and some discernment. So the entire story is talking about someone or something being wrong because of someone's misuse of their power, and how that thing comes back to humbles, to restore justice in some ways, to balance things out again. And you know what? When I was learning about these stories and reading about it, I was like, okay, so what? This is their initial interaction, and this is all the craziness that goes on right at the beginning when Shani Saturn's born. But what happens after? What happened between Surya and Shani? Did the sun learn anything from this experience? Did they actually reconcile things, or did they just have this infinite cosmic conflict for all eternity. And you know what? If you know this for a fact that comes from a text, please let me know. There are no explicit narratives that says that there was any kind of a reconciliation between the two of them. But when you think about it, there is some sort of a reconciliation, because even when we think about oppositions, in our mind, if we want to have black and white thinking, opposition just means two very different things, but they are, as I said earlier, representing a spectrum. And Sun and Saturn are representing a spectrum of power. So even when we go to the zodiac and we go and see the planetary designations, we can see that there's some kind of a reconciliation. They are still working within the same system. For example, it's not like Saturn's sign is opposing Mars's sign. Saturn's sign, its domicile, is opposing the sun's. So they have this inherent, infinite, forever, eternity connection to each other. There's Leo, and then there's Aquarius. There's the other luminary, which is, we could almost say it's the other half of the sun, which is the moon and the sign of Cancer, and then Capricorn sitting across that in opposition to that. I have come across they're more like folklore stories, not from the traditional text, that there's a story where Surya becomes very ill at some point. He just feels weak and frail. And whatever he does, he can't regain his strength. And when he confides, when he talks to the other gods, they tell him, well, this is because of Shani and you need to seek his forgiveness. So it's been said that he humbles himself a little bit, performs penance, and lowering his light to be able to reconnect to some degree to his son, which we can see this is actually very much explicitly explained about what he had to do with his wife Sanjana to be able to get her back. And you know, even if we want to call Saturn malefic and we don't want to have anything to do with Saturn's signification, these 7 planets are describing some parts of our own psychology and our drive within us. For example, think about how you feel, or when you see that there's injustice in the world and you really feel the injustice where you can see that someone's misusing their power. We have this inner feeling that we want justice. It's we come to modify this feeling, but the way that it unfolds itself as an instinct, that thing was unfair, the other person must pay. But why do we want to pay? We're not psychotic, masochistic, we're not trying to hurt other people. But there has to be this balance of power for the world to be functional. We can't have abusers constantly abusing people and then have a functional society, a functional world, a functional life. So even instinctually, Saturn, as part of our own drive, unfolds within our mind when there's a misuse of power in this way. So we can say that within all of us, there is that solar power, the sun, which represents consciousness, self, identity, our sense of I, self-concept. But it needs the grounding of Saturn because it is the I that performs the acts. It is the I that asserts itself. So there's a sense of power here, right? And the sun is the masculine principle. It is action-oriented and is outward moving. So we got to know how we're directing externally and how we're impacting our environment. And sometimes we can get so hot-headed that we think what we have to do and what we're doing, that's how it ought to be. Other people should bow down to us, clear the way so we can do it. But when we do that, we're not corresponding to reality because we're being life-denying in a lot of ways. So that Saturn quality that also comes into humbles this, in reality, it's connecting us to the entirety of the ecosystem and the system that we live in. It preventing us from burning other people out, blinding other people, or becoming blinded to ourselves and what we're doing. That's what the humbling effect of Saturn is. And as I was saying earlier, Saturn himself has this humble essence in himself too, because he is still orbiting the sun. When he got thrown out there, he didn't go rogue. He picked himself up and slowly started to follow the order of existence and the order of the world. He didn't misuse his own power either. So in a lot of ways, we can say that his harshness and the way that he's cruel and malefic is not some sort of a psychopathic destruction or some masochistic way of being. It's not trying to obliterate all power because itself went through that experience and it's representing powerlessness. It's actually about establishing some sort of an equilibrium within a system. It's talking about distribution of power in a way that's fair and just. And we can see this, one of the reasons why Saturn's exalted in the sign of Libra, which is about balance and justice. So in a lot of ways, Saturn is maintaining the cosmic order. Saturn's actions are dharmic. It's saying that Saturn's making sure that everything exists in its proper proportion and contained within the bounds of reality, so that reality as a system, existence as a system in itself, can be functional. And Saturn as a planet of negativity, this is not psychological negativity, this is like deduction, the minus sign, deducing, editing, reducing, is acting as an editor to get rid of the superfluous aspects of life. And when we have a lot of ego, we're not humble, we become harmful. There's something superfluous, extra, and useless and harmful within us towards the entirety of the ecosystem that we live in, which could be our family, which could be our career, which are other significations of the sun. So that's what Saturn's doing. So when we have this conjunction, in a lot of ways, we're talking about the confrontation of reality with an ego structure that is not based in reality. And when the ego is not in proportion and in non-correspondence to reality, we can become a sight that's actually blinding, because we have this desire to shine, to be known, to be acknowledged. And Saturn comes in to restrict so that everything's measured. It's like you don't need to create that disability in other people by blinding them because of what you need. So it's equalizing things. Saturn is the great equalizer. At the end, Saturn signifies death. One thing we all have in common, we were born and we will all die. That death part belongs to Saturn, and Saturn is the greatest equalizer. And when I tell you they represent a spectrum, Sun and Saturn, that birth aspect of it in a chart, we look at it in terms of ascendant, but that soul being manifest is related to the two luminaries, sun and moon. The sun as the soul, and then the end of it is related to Saturn. So that spectrum, we can even see it in terms of how they're representing the beginning and the end of a story. So in a lot of ways, when Sun and Saturn come into a conjunction, Saturn's trying to ground us into reality, every aspect of the self, all of Sun's symbols. And when this conjunction happens, the lessons that it unfolds, they can be brutal, because we might feel weaker than usual. In a chart, it brings a sense of weakness. Sun represents confidence. When Saturn comes, it meddles with that kind of self-confidence that we have. Our sense of vitality becomes a little less. Sun represents vision. We might feel stuck and we can't reach our destination. The nodes create that fogginess where you might not know where you want to go, but Saturn acts like a roadblock. Like you see it, but there are so many obstacles that it's very difficult to get to it. And Saturn just brings a sense of heaviness and a lot of responsibilities when it comes into conjunction with the sun, is holding the self responsible for its vision, for the way that it wants to shine, for the way that it wants to be known, for the path that it wants to choose. Like if you have any sense of entitlement with the sun in this conjunction, Saturn will torment in that way. You're not entitled to anything. What have you worked for? Do the work, do the hard work, pay your dues for the next 20, 30 years, then we'll see. We'll see if that karmic batch will come up. Saturn and Sun conjunction bring this kind of a feeling. So it's saying something about we have to become patient, resilient, humble. And essentially all of this is an opportunity for growth in life. In the hindsight, when it's all said and done, what is that saying? It goes something along the lines of that which was not hard to attain was not worth having. So Saturn kind of bring this kind of a feeling. It's hard earned, but when you have it, the having of that thing doesn't even matter. The process and the procedure to it changed you as a person. It made you stronger in a lot of ways. It gave you a kind of wisdom and maturity that is more valuable than what you were trying to get anyway. So in this way, Saturn is not just a force of limitation when it comes to our life and the way that we understand life. It is also a source of wisdom in the long run, of life. And that slow perspective of time, which we call a lifetime. And to get through this lifetime, it requires us to be realistic, to have a sense of realism. A lot of time in life, we have to be practical. Yeah, we have these big dreams and we want to announce them and we want to shine and we want fame and we want acknowledgement. But Saturn doesn't want to give any of that when it's unearned. Saturn is a planet of objectivity and rationality. That's why it's constantly asking, hey, that thing that you think you are, or that thing that you think that you want, does it correspond to reality? Have you done what is required? So we can see Saturn's constantly demanding endurance, forbearance, patience. It's asking us to cultivate the ground, these trees and these fruits that you want to have. Cultivate the ground, sow the seed, attend to it year in and year out. And then eventually your apple tree will give you an apple. So it's kind of teaching us real life applications for how the self perceives itself, conceptualizes itself, and what it thinks it's entitled to. Saturn saying in due time with plenty of work. And in this process, Saturn, Shani, is showing us how we need to mature and where we need to mature when we pay attention. It shows us where we have a false sense of self-narrative in terms of who we think we are and what we're entitled to and how life ought to be, and how things can really be because of what you actually do and how you actually show up in the world, how you exert your power, for instance. And you know what? It is when we resist these things that Saturn wants from us that we get that malefic, insufferable aspects of Saturn. That's when we get Saturn's relentless cruelty and the way that we just feel the hardship of life. Life itself just feels like a really bad trip when we can't understand what's the Saturn archetype, what Saturn is demanding of us. And when we go back to the narrative of Saturn and his father, the sun, it's showing us that the true power doesn't come from your ego, from that part of you where you feel like that's how things ought to be because this is who I am. I deserve that because I'm this kind of a person. Like having that unrelenting drive for recognition and dominance. Saturn's showing power is actually in terms of how you can shoulder the responsibilities that are designated to you. How are you accountable for other people? Because when we are responsible and we are accountable, we are actually life generating. And accountability and reliability are actually significations of sun. But when we have these distorted ego, sense of self, we're not reliable. We're not accountable to other people. We're constantly betraying life. So Saturn's actually shown up to give the sun back to itself by showing it the reality of things. And you know, to just conclude this video, I feel like it's been going on again forever. The way that we can reconcile the energies of this conjunction is to understand ego and the necessity of humility for an ego. Like, what is an ego? These are things worth contemplating. And we need the ego. I'm not saying get rid of the ego. That is a crock of BS that I think psychology has just been warped and distorted by just casually talking about these concepts. We need the ego in order to understand our own inner needs and then to come and intersect with the external world to create this dynamic with it, to become an identification marker out in the world. But when how we identify ourselves internally is not based in reality, when we externalize ourselves, we disturb reality in a lot of ways. So when I say that the reconciliation of this conjunction is in understanding what a healthy ego is and what an egocentric perspective is, and what is the relationship of humility to this? How do we balance this? And then understanding when it is malaligned, misaligned, how misuse of power, it's actually life denying, where the sun is supposed to be life generating. And Saturn's actually coming in to show us that, hey, if we can balance this misuse of power, we can use power in a way that is life generating, which is again good for the sun, because that's a symbolism of the sun. In general, Saturn wants us to be just. So I'll just leave this here for now, this Sun-Saturn conjunction in the context of this narrative. In the next video, I'm going to come back to talk about Sun conjunct Saturn in the sign of Pisces and that entire transit that's happening in 2025. And then I'm working on, at the moment, I'm just writing it, but the Saturn one is almost done. Even though, despite everything that I said, in these videos, I'm going to talk about how and why we need to be mindful when we start idealizing malefics as a human being. When we take these archetypes and we try to embody and emulate them, and not understanding that as an existential function, they operationalize things, but outside of that context, they can become very life destroying and life denying. So I will come back to talk about that too, as Saturn's archetype and why we should be aware when we idealize Saturn. And the other planets in that series will be Mars, Rahu, and Ketu also. So I'll come back to talk about these topics, and I think that's about it. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Much love. Till next time.